we can yap a little bit in between about the dynamic process of training. We just saw a case where the user learns and goes from one point to an expert, and there are different interactions with the industry. The whole process of how the industry and the vendor approached it is dynamic as well. And I can't emphasize how much and how important it is to a technology or a product to identify the failure modes, the risk modes, the points that really are critical and the points that are extraneous, because that's going to change as well over time. And as these things change, if you get lucky enough to get a sudden penetration in a market, big risk mode, you better have identified those points. And the key thing is to listen to your early adopters, your early users, because what's in an investigator brochure in an early phase interaction becomes an IFU later on, becomes the reason you're successful in the last phase. And it's all a very different process that's, again, not represented. It's not a linear process. Everything's changing. Users learn, community learns, vendors learn. Identifying which of the important priorities in the training is key. Anyway.
Yeah, thank you. So, we're training on a 3-phase mode. And again, as Mark said, these were all the training programs and proposals were all part of what the FDA looked at, and we worked with them to develop those and get them to a position that everybody was happy with. We do have an advantage in that a lot of our products, because our manufacturing, our corporate headquarters is based in France, a lot of our devices are on the European market first. So by the time we're bringing them to the US, there's a little bit of a track record on the training methods, and we just really take it and adopt it more to US physicians and US, people learn a little bit differently and all those things. So we massage it into that. And then when we launch it, we're, as you pointed out, you want to constantly be getting feedback on that, whether it's the first phase and what people think of that, the kind of the more online, here's the background, here's the technology, all that. And when we go into the second phase, we have physicians that we train with European physicians to become proctors. We send them out. First couple cases are done with a proctor. The proctor does an evaluation of the new surgeon, and then they go into the third period where you have somebody there monitoring their procedure. It's not a proctoring surgeon, but they're now at a stage where they can do it on their own. Somebody's watching. You get so many cases there, and then we move on to where you have the ability to get live support on site if you need it for a procedure. But we're always looking for feedback, whether it be from the surgeons that are being trained, from the proctors that are doing the training, and from our clinical field folks that are out there observing the procedures.
Mm-hmm. You have an interesting, unique perspective in Europe, the US. Have you seen any changes in training and credentialing in terms of the new 2020 European regs that have already been implemented in practice in many ways?
Yeah,
little tighter requirements. Is the training fitting into that and how you approach it?
Yeah, well, so the new medical device regulation in Europe is just really starting to get going, so we haven't seen how it's going to impact the European training development model. We haven't seen that yet, but I'm sure it'll be coming.
But you have a product out there, so some of the earlier folks may be already implementing it, since they have to be ready when it comes
right,
online.
The training
they may already be
there.
acting in a tighter mode.
And in Europe, the technology has been out there more, so the training isn't like, oh, I've got this new thing. It's more like, okay, we're moving along with that. And even now that we've just launched our second generation device, and so we've got now a situation of surgeons who were trained and proficient on the first one. Now, their institution is going to buy the new one, and how do we adapt the training now that we're actually getting into the start of a cycle of as you come out with new generations of devices, how do you adapt the training for that? And I think that's a more unique challenge, and it's just ensuring that everything gets vetted from headquarters all the way down.
Mm-hmm. Have any of you ever been approached by a physician who wants to do the procedure who you didn't think was the typical type of physician to do that procedure? And would you let a general internal medicine doctor perform a thyroid or any other kind of procedure? Do you have certain physicians in mind that you only want to certify for your procedure?
We don't.
You don't want,
We don't have a specific physician in mind. 99.999% have been done by urologists, but the technology, as Dr. Viviano said, it's not restricted to a specific set of credentials that the physician brings in. And I think it's one of the things that focused ultrasound, in terms of a multidisciplinary approach, needs to be open to, is the fact that we do have interventional radiologists doing these procedures. Focused ultrasound is ideally suited, frankly, in the world of radiation oncology, because they have physicists, dosimetrists, support staff. So I think for this technology to penetrate as much as possible, despite the fact that our primary users, urologists, might disagree with me, I think it needs to be open to anybody as long as they meet the training requirements and the experience requirements that are necessary.
And ultimately, if there's a system that incentivizes multiple disciplines, then you'll have a multidisciplinary solution, which is best for the patient. But oftentimes, the RVUs and the paradigms aren't set up to meet that ultimate goal. And
That's
where
one
we
of
have
the,
to-
that's one of the reasons why radiosurgery took off when it did, because neurosurgeons and radiation oncologists and radiologists worked together to divvy up the pot, if you will, so that everybody was happy.
I'm not sure if I agree 100% on that front. I mean, we're a little bit different, I guess, because we have the MRI and the treatment going on at the same time. So by definition, we need to approach it a little bit more as a multidisciplinary team. So naturally, we'll have, you know, multiple disciplines involved in the treatment instead of sort of exclusively urology, for example. But so I do agree that we need to define confounds that allow a few different specialties to participate. So for example, a radiologist, interventional radiologist, or radiation oncologist may all have similar backgrounds and knowledge sets that can provide, you know, safe and effective treatment of prostate tissue. But to sort of open it up to anybody, you know, I don't think I would agree to have a dermatologist, for example, do the treatment planning and treatment monitoring in our case.
But the reality is you can't prevent them from.
Well, so I mean, we talked a lot about, and we're going to run out of time, so I don't want to take too much, but we talked a lot about the different training programs, which is great, and I think from our perspective, I don't have too much to add in terms of the structure of the training program. But what we didn't talk that much about was the credentialing aspect of it. So I am interested to know, sort of as a field, where we think this is heading in terms of course, each device is going to have their device-specific training and certification, but as a field, what are some of the steps that we can take to implement some sort of credentialing to, you know, control some of these things?
So as I mentioned, we leave that up to the hospitals at the current time, and we have had hospitals where that credentialing decision did not allow, let's say, a radiation oncologist or a radiologist to use the equipment. But at this point in time, at least for us, that's a credentialing issue which is under the domain of the hospitals, as we see it.
As a practical matter, it's easier to learn and safely and effectively perform an ultrasound-guided procedure than it is and there's some cost hurdles as well. There's a number of different hurdles for MR, which may add value, but the bottom line is the imaging infrastructure that you're based upon will often dictate whether or not someone's automatically at the table, like the radiologist or the interventional radiologist.
So Brad, I have a quick question and a comment. Is there a role of this particular field of society, like you know, in radiation or radiology or urology, giving a certificate or continuing medical education?
Great question. I think that if the FUS is and the FUSF and their role is not to be undersold, and it's sort of taken for granted. We've seen it evolve in the 6 last symposiums and as the group's grown under Neil's leadership and the funding for it. But really, there's no other real technology that's evolved with this similar foundation and infrastructure. So that the value of that cannot be overemphasized. And we often, in the community here, we all drink the Kool-Aid, but we take it for granted. And I think there's a huge role to play for FUSF as this unfolds, and whether it's training, credentialing, or reimbursements, regulatory, all these pieces.
Yeah, I hope that the FUS Foundation can play a role in convening the community to get the necessary people involved in strategizing about the baseline level of training procedures, post-market approval, follow-up with remote support is especially important with these very highly technical machines that one button may be working one day or have trouble the next. So I think the FUS Foundation can play an important role
But
in-
without that forum, things fall apart. And the timeline to adoption or reimbursement is much longer. And you think this has been a long time since the 40s in Fry. I mean, this is the rapid pace in the last few years and in the next few years is key, but it's really been enabled by this foundation and will be.
And I suspect that if the foundation were to move forward with a credentialing program, that the hospitals would defer to the Focused Ultrasound Foundation and say, if you're a practitioner within my hospital and you're going to be doing this and there's a credentialing society, you need to have credentials from that society.
If you have a foundation to reference, and even, again, there are a lot of different entities and players in the kitchen, but if you have something to reference, it gives you a starting point, whether you're going to a residency, a specialty society, a ruck panel for coding, evaluation. It always helps to have a little structure that has a stamp and an emblem and a name and a nonprofit associated with it.
And somebody to also drive forward some kind of continuing education programs. I think that's also going to be critical here, and I don't know if you guys would agree there that, you know, some physicians get trained, they become experts, either you have changeover in staff at the site or they don't treat enough patients to maintain knowledge in the device, or they take a sabbatical, and when they come back, you know, they've sort of forgotten how to use the device.
Certainly changeover in staff is important because you train them initially, they change over, you then have to train again. I think all of us who have commercial products in the field have user groups, and at those user groups, that's continuing education from the point of reviewing cases, reviewing how to get more out of the software, the hardware, so I think that process goes on.
If there was some sort of mandatory component to it, you know, again, if some foundation was running some program, continuing education program that you had to, at a minimum, once a year, undergo some sort of course or test or something, I mean, I think it would be, as a manufacturer, that gives me some level of satisfaction that there's a certain minimum being maintained. You know.
I think you've all just committed to a monthly phone call with me now. So, I look forward to having that, and I think we're up on time. So thank you for listening. Thank you for your participation, and again, important conversations that we continue to have. Thank you.